Other folklore. Hi, welcome back to Rabbit Hole History, where each week for 6 weeks I dive into a historical topic that I'm interested in. And this week we are back with episode 5 of my series on ancient Europe. If you didn't catch last week's video, it was one of my favorite videos in this series and seems to be a theme in my series so far. I cooked and I made a homemade ball of mozzarella cheese, and I actually managed to make cheese. I ended up making dinner with it the next night, so definitely go check that out if you haven't already. And this week we're going to get into a subject that I think would make little girl Shannon very proud. You may also be quite proud of me if you too were a child growing up in the early aughts and consumed magical girl content like Winx Club or all of those Barbie fairy mermaid movies. Yes, today we are going to talk about fairies and their historical significance and origins in prehistoric European culture. So let's just get right back into it. Welcome back to Rabbit Hole History. So if you remember from my first episode in Series 2 on ancient European history, we talked about the bog bodies and the historical and spiritual significance of the bogs. Strange phenomena would occur due to the weather circumstances in the bog that would cause people to see flashes of light and weird mystical looking things that they would believe to be fairies and spirits. But the first known written record of fairies was actually from the 13th century in England. This came from a man called Gervase of Tilbury, who is very well known throughout medieval folklore study as a prime source of folklore literature. Now, I've read that he was actually a lawyer, and his greatest known work is the Otia Imperialia, which translates to Recreation for an Emperor. It's also known as the Book of Marvels. The work is actually considered to be an encyclopedia of sorts, but the credibility comes into question a little bit because he does mention supernatural creatures like fairies. We may call the work into question, but I've never met a fairy, so I'm not counting Gervase out just yet. But anyway, Gervase did not describe fairies the way that we might see them and depict them today. He described them as old men with wrinkled cheeks and very, very tiny, like the size of your little finger. And they worked on farms. They were farm workers. Other folklore around the 13th century described fairies as maybe helpful or guardians. They were described as brownies or hobgoblins. And while they were unsightly, they were helpful and would complete little tasks around the house. Then there were less kind types of fairies like banshees or goblins that were either up to no good or, in the case of a goblin, always up to no good. And other legends of evil, malignant fairies and spirits come back to the bog, and in examples like will-o'-the-wisp or jack-o'-lanterns. I should also mention that the different types of fairies are pretty all-encompassing, something that I didn't realize until I started researching for this episode. Different types of fairies also include dwarves, elves, gnomes, goblins, leprechauns, sprites. They all kind of fall under the grand umbrella of fairies. Now, those are all different separate rabbit holes for a different day probably, but today I wanted to talk about kind of the most prominent pieces of folklore or myths surrounding fairies specifically. Let's start with changelings, because I think that's a weird one. A changeling in ancient folklore is a fairy that has been left in place of a baby. It was thought that the fairies had stolen the baby and replaced it with another fairy, or in some cases, and some legends will say that it's an old man fairy living out the rest of their days in the peace and comfort of a baby's lifestyle. Although I don't know how comfortable a baby's lifestyle really is. People take care of you, but you kind of poop your own pants and you don't really know how to talk yet. The historian and folklorist D.L. Ashleman proposed that the changeling has kind of a dark origin, where in a lot of history people didn't believe that children and babies were even worth having because they didn't provide much to society and productivity as a whole, especially to a poorer family that relied on numbers and the quantity of people able to work and provide for your family. This also being a time where children and babies weren't really considered innocent and sweet like we picture them now, but rather full of sin and needing to be taught the ways of the world and how to be kind of all-powerful, fearing. Historical evidence suggests that the Changeling was kind of a justification for not keeping your children. But let's move on to Pixies, shall we? A pixie is basically what you would see as a typical portrayal of a fairy today. Think Tinkerbell and her friends. They are described as little, about 4 inches tall, with wings, and they float around, living in the forests and gardens. They seem to be mischievous, but not too mischievous, just kind of like little twerps. And in Britannica, they are described as having favorite pastimes, including leading travelers astray and frightening young maidens. The girls are scared. But they're little pranksters, they're little divas, and the original Disney movie with Peter Pan and Tinkerbell in it is probably the best depiction of a pixie as it's been described throughout history. And then you have the elf, which is very similar to a pixie in folklore at least. They're kind of mischievous creatures that take on a humanoid form but are really tiny. And as we have seen in every fantasy adaptation of folklore, like Skyrim or Dungeons and Dragons, they're separated into light elves and dark elves, which typically means the differentiation between good and evil. So that's where I'm going to put a pin in this week's rabbit hole. If you've been following this channel at all, then you know it's been a little while since I've put out a video. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus because I moved across country. But now that I've put this video out, this was kind of going to be the last video in this series before I did a little wrap up, but I'm really excited to get on to my next season, which I'm going to talk about my road trip and the destinations that I visited, and I want to just jump right back into that. So that's going to be the plan going forward. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the series. If you haven't watched the other videos in my series yet, and my videos from my Ancient Greek series, definitely go check those out. And I think that's it for me this week. And really excited to get started on the next chapter of Rabbit Hole History. And thank you again for watching. If you made it this far, wow, thanks. And yeah, that'll be it. We'll see you next week.